In the autumn of 1863, when the Civil War had torn Missouri apart and left countless families shattered, I stumbled upon documents that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Hidden beneath the floorboards of an abandoned farmhouse outside Springfield. These yellowed papers contained the most disturbing medical records I had ever encountered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 infants born on the same night to the same mother, each bearing identical birthmarks that formed strange symbols across their tiny bodies. What made this discovery truly terrifying was not just the mysterious circumstances of their birth, but the fact that every scientist, doctor, and researcher who attempted to study these children simply vanished without a trace. The war had ravaged Missouri like few other states, with neighbor fighting neighbor and communities torn apart by loyalties that shifted like autumn leaves. Springfield sat at the crossroads of this conflict, a town that had changed hands between Union and Confederate forces so many times that residents had stopped counting. The year 1863 brought particular hardship, as General Nathaniel Lyon's defeat at the Battle of Wilson's Creek 2 years prior still cast its shadow over the region, leaving behind burned homesteads, abandoned farms, and families scattered to the winds. It was during this chaotic period that I first learned of the Whitmore family, though their true name would prove to be just one of many mysteries surrounding their existence. Samuel Whitmore had purchased a modest farm 7 miles southeast of Springfield in early 1862, paying cash for the 160 acres of fertile bottomland along Wilson Creek. The transaction, recorded in the Greene County Courthouse, noted him as a widower from Kentucky, seeking a fresh start away from the violence that had consumed his home state. Samuel presented himself as a man of modest means, but respectable background, claiming to have lost his first wife to consumption and his small tobacco farm to debt. He carried letters of introduction from a Methodist minister in Louisville. Though when I later attempted to verify these references, I discovered that no such minister had ever existed at the address provided. The local residents who met Samuel during his first months in the area described him as a quiet, industrious man who kept to himself, but always offered fair payment for goods and services. What made Samuel Whitmore unusual among the war refugees? Flooding into Missouri was not his background, which seemed typical of the displaced family seeking safety in the borderlands, but rather his apparent immunity to the hardships that plagued everyone else in the region. While neighboring farms struggled with crop failures, livestock theft, and the constant threat of raids by irregular forces from both sides, the Whitmore property seemed to thrive under mysterious circumstances that no one could adequately explain. Samuel's farmhouse, though modest in appearance, had been extensively modified with additions that served no obvious agricultural purpose. The basement had been excavated far deeper than necessary for root storage, extending beneath the original foundation and connecting to what appeared to be natural limestone caves that honeycombed the area's underground geology. Local craftsmen hired to help with these modifications reported that Samuel insisted on working alone during the final phases of construction, dismissing their services once the basic framework had been completed. The house itself stood 2 stories, tall, constructed of local limestone and timber, with a wraparound porch that provided commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Samuel had positioned the structure on a small rise that offered natural defensive advantages while remaining inconspicuous from the main roads that connected Springfield to the smaller communities scattered throughout the region. The property included several outbuildings that appeared to serve standard farming functions, though visitors noted that these structures remained locked even during daylight hours, when farm work typically required easy access to tools and equipment. During the spring of 1863, Samuel surprised his neighbors by announcing his engagement to Rebecca Mason, a young woman who had allegedly arrived from Tennessee carrying credentials as a trained midwife and herbalist. Rebecca claimed to be fleeing The violence that had consumed her home state, where her previous employment with several prominent families had ended when the war disrupted normal social structures and economic relationships. Her knowledge of medical practices and childbirth procedures made her immediately valuable in a community where professional medical care remained scarce and expensive. Rebecca's background, like her future husband's, contained elements that seemed plausible on the surface but revealed troubling inconsistencies when examined more carefully. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She possessed an extensive collection of medical texts, surgical instruments, and pharmaceutical supplies that seemed far beyond what a simple midwife would typically own or be able to afford. Her techniques for treating various ailments incorporated procedures that appeared more advanced than what most frontier medical practitioners would have learned through traditional apprenticeship or limited formal education. More unsettling were the questions that Rebecca asked during her consultations with local women. Inquiries that seemed designed to gather information about family histories, genetic traits, and reproductive patterns rather than addressing immediate medical concerns. Several women who sought her services reported feeling uncomfortable with her persistent questions about their ancestors, the circumstances of their own births, and whether unusual traits or abilities ran in their families. These conversations often continued long after the medical consultation had ended, with Rebecca displaying an intense curiosity about hereditary characteristics that seemed excessive for routine healthcare. The wedding ceremony took place in June 1863 at the Methodist Church in Springfield, witnessed by approximately 30 guests who represented the small community of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who had come to know the couple during their brief residence in the area. Reverend Thomas Patterson, who performed the ceremony, later described both Samuel and Rebecca as devout Christians who demonstrated appropriate knowledge of Scripture and church doctrine, though he noted that their religious discussions sometimes included references to biblical passages and theological concepts that seemed unusually sophisticated for simple farming folk. The newlyweds settled into their modified farmhouse with what appeared to be genuine happiness and mutual affection, though neighbors observed that they maintained more privacy than was typical for rural couples who usually relied on community support and social interaction to survive the challenges of frontier life. Samuel and Rebecca rarely attended social gatherings, church services, or community work days that brought families together for mutual assistance with major projects like barn raisings, harvest activities, or road maintenance. Their isolation became more pronounced as Rebecca's pregnancy progressed through the late summer and early autumn of 1863. She had announced her condition in July, claiming to expect delivery sometime in early winter based on her calculations and professional experience with prenatal care. However, several women in the community who had personal experience with multiple pregnancies noted that Rebecca's physical changes seemed more dramatic than would be expected for a single child, leading to whispered speculation about the possibility of twins or other complications that might require special medical attention. Dr. William Hayes, Springfield's only licensed physician, offered his services when he learned of Rebecca's pregnancy, explaining that midwifery alone might prove insufficient if complications arose during delivery. Rebecca politely declined his assistance, claiming that her own medical knowledge and Samuel's support would be adequate for a normal birth. She also mentioned that they had made arrangements for additional help if circumstances required more specialized care, though she remained vague about the nature of these arrangements or the identity of the medical professionals she claimed to have contacted. As autumn progressed toward winter, the Whitmore property became the subject of increasing curiosity and speculation among their neighbors, who noticed unusual activities that seemed to intensify as Rebecca's delivery date approached. Strange lights could be seen emanating from the farmhouse windows during late-night hours, Not the steady glow of oil lamps or candles typically used for routine household activities, but flickering illumination that suggested more complex procedures, requiring careful timing and precise manipulation. Visitors to the property during this period reported hearing sounds from within the house that seemed inconsistent with normal domestic activities or routine farm work. These included mechanical noises that suggested the operation of equipment more sophisticated than typical household items, chemical odors that resembled those associated with medical or scientific procedures, and conversations conducted in what appeared to be foreign languages or technical terminology that neither Samuel nor Rebecca had previously demonstrated any knowledge of during their interactions with community members. The most disturbing observations came from Samuel's hired hands, two local men named Jacob Miller and Thomas Brown, who assisted with routine farming tasks and property maintenance. Both reported that Samuel had begun dismissing them from work earlier each day as Rebecca's pregnancy advanced, claiming that their services were no longer needed after mid-afternoon. However, both men noted that the sounds of activity from the farmhouse and outbuildings continued well into the evening hours, suggesting that Samuel was conducting work that required privacy and secrecy rather than simply reducing his agricultural operations for the winter season. Jacob Miller, who had worked for Samuel since early summer, became particularly concerned when he discovered that one of the outbuildings contained equipment that bore no relationship to farming activities. Through a crack in the wooden siding, he observed what appeared to be laboratory apparatus, including glass containers, metal instruments, and devices that seemed designed for precise measurement or chemical analysis. The building also contained books and documents written in languages that Jacob could not identify, though the technical diagrams and anatomical illustrations suggested scientific or medical subject matter. Thomas Brown reported similar observations, noting that Samuel had begun receiving deliveries of supplies that arrived during evening hours when most legitimate businesses would be closed. These shipments included wooden crates and metal containers that required careful handling, suggesting fragile or dangerous contents that needed special storage conditions. The delivery wagons bore no identifying marks or business names, and the drivers typically departed immediately after unloading their cargo, without engaging in the social conversation that usually accompanied commercial transactions in rural communities. On the night of December 15th, 1863, a violent winter storm struck Greene County with unprecedented fury, bringing heavy snow, bitter cold, and winds that rattled windows and doors throughout the region. The storm created perfect cover for whatever events transpired at the Whitmore farmhouse during the dark hours before dawn, events that would transform a simple tale of frontier childbirth into something far more sinister and mysterious than anyone in the community could have imagined. The storm's intensity forced most residents to remain inside their homes, making it impossible for neighbors to observe the unusual lights and sounds that several people later reported emanating from the Whitmore property throughout that terrible night. The few individuals brave enough to venture outside during brief lulls in the wind described seeing illumination from the farmhouse windows that seemed far brighter than would be expected from oil lamps or candles, creating an eerie glow that penetrated the swirling snow and reflected off the ice-covered trees surrounding the property. When dawn finally broke on December 16th, revealing a landscape transformed by more than 2 feet of fresh snow, Samuel Whitmore made his way to Springfield despite the dangerous traveling conditions to announce the birth of his children. Not child, but children. Rebecca had delivered sextuplets during the night, 6 infants born within a span of 3 hours despite the absence of any medical assistance beyond Samuel's own efforts and Rebecca's professional knowledge. The announcement created immediate sensation in Springfield, where multiple births of such magnitude were virtually unknown and considered medically remarkable if not impossible. Dr. Hayes immediately offered his services to examine the infants and provide any necessary medical care, explaining that sextuplets would require specialized attention to ensure their survival during the critical first weeks of life. Samuel thanked the doctor for his concern, but insisted that all 6 children were healthy and that Rebecca's recovery was proceeding normally without complications. However, when well-meaning neighbors attempted to visit the farmhouse to offer assistance and congratulations, they found the property strangely inaccessible despite Samuel's apparent ability to travel to town the previous morning. The access road remained blocked by snowdrifts that seemed impossibly deep and persistent, as if the storm had specifically targeted the Whitmore property while leaving neighboring farms relatively clear. Several attempts to reach the house on foot through the surrounding fields proved unsuccessful, with visitors becoming disoriented and forced to turn back despite their familiarity with the local terrain. The few individuals who managed to approach close enough to observe the farmhouse reported seeing unusual signs of activity that seemed inconsistent with a household recovering from a difficult childbirth, rather than the quiet atmosphere typically associated with new mothers and fragile infants. The property showed evidence of ongoing work that required considerable physical effort and technical expertise. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys simultaneously, suggesting that several rooms required heating for purposes beyond simple comfort, and the sounds of construction or modification work could be heard emanating from the basement area where Samuel had previously conducted his mysterious excavations. Most disturbing were the reports of infant cries that seemed to come from multiple locations throughout the property rather than from a single nursery where 6 newborns would logically be housed together for efficient care and monitoring. These sounds suggested that the children had been separated into different rooms or buildings, an arrangement that would make caring for them far more difficult while serving no obvious medical or practical purpose that experienced mothers in covetous medicine. The community could understand or explain. Dr. Hayes grew increasingly concerned about the welfare of both Rebecca and the infants as days passed without any opportunity to examine them or verify their condition. Professional medical ethics and genuine concern for their health motivated his persistent attempts to reach the farmhouse, but each effort met with polite but firm resistance from Samuel, who continued to insist that his family required no outside assistance and that medical intervention might actually pose risks to their continued well-being. The doctor's concerns intensified when he learned that Samuel had been quietly purchasing large quantities of medical supplies from the town's general store and pharmacy, including the items that seemed far beyond what would be necessary for routine infant care. These purchases included surgical instruments, chemical compounds used for preservation and analysis, and specialized equipment typically associated with scientific research rather than childcare. When questioned about these unusual acquisitions, Samuel explained that Rebecca's medical knowledge enabled her to provide more sophisticated care than might be available elsewhere in the region. As winter progressed through January and February of 1864, the mystery surrounding the Whitmore sextuplets deepened rather than resolved, creating an atmosphere of growing unease among Springfield's residents who had initially celebrated the remarkable birth as a sign of hope during the dark days of war. The children remained invisible to the outside world despite being nearly 2 months old, an isolation that seemed to contradict the normal patterns of frontier family life where community support played a crucial role in child rearing and survival. The situation took a more ominous turn when Dr. Hayes received an unexpected visit from Dr. Cornelius Shaw, a physician who introduced himself as a specialist in unusual medical conditions, working under the auspices of the federal government's wartime health initiatives. Shaw claimed to have learned about the sextuplets through medical correspondence networks and expressed intense scientific interest in examining the children to document their development and contribute to advancing knowledge about multiple births and infant survival rates. Dr. Shaw's credentials appeared legitimate, including letters of introduction from medical schools in Philadelphia and Chicago. Though his intense focus on the Whitmore children seemed to extend beyond routine scientific curiosity into something approaching obsession. He spoke about the sextuplets as if they represented opportunities for groundbreaking research that could advance medical science by decades, describing potential studies and experiments that made Dr. Hayes increasingly uncomfortable with the visitor's true intentions and motivations. When Shaw learned that Samuel had consistently refused medical examination for the children, he became visibly agitated and began asking detailed questions about the family's background, their reasons for settling in Missouri, and any unusual circumstances surrounding Rebecca's pregnancy and delivery. His inquiries revealed knowledge about the Whitmores that seemed to extend far beyond what he could have learned through casual medical correspondence, suggesting that he had been researching the family for reasons that had nothing to do with routine scientific interest. Dr. Hayes later recalled feeling deeply unsettled by Shaw's visit, particularly when the man produced detailed anatomical drawings and scientific equipment that he claimed would be necessary for proper examination of the infants. The instruments included devices that Hayes had never seen before, despite his own medical education and years of practice, leading him to question whether Shaw's intentions were truly benevolent or whether the children might be in danger from this mysterious researcher who seemed to know far more about their situation than he was willing to admit. The next morning, Dr. Hayes discovered that Shaw had departed Springfield during the night without explanation, leaving behind only a cryptic message suggesting that more qualified researchers would soon arrive to conduct the studies that the local medical community was apparently incapable of performing. This ominous warning proved to be the first indication that the Whitmore sextuplets had attracted attention from forces far more powerful and dangerous than a simple rural community could comprehend or resist. The weeks following Dr. Shaw's mysterious departure brought an unsettling calm to the Whitmore property, a silence that felt more ominous than the strange activities that had previously characterized the isolated farmstead. Samuel continued his routine trips to Springfield for supplies, maintaining the facade of a typical farmer tending to his growing family. Yet his demeanor had changed in subtle ways that did not escape the notice of observant townspeople. Where he had once engaged in polite conversation about weather, crops, and local news, he now conducted his business with mechanical efficiency, purchasing specific items from predetermined lists and departing without the social interaction that typically accompanied such visits. Rebecca remained entirely absent from public view, supposedly recovering from the difficult birth while caring for 6 demanding infants. According to Samuel's explanations, she dedicated every waking moment to nursing, feeding, and monitoring the children's development, work that required such constant attention that she could not spare time for social visits or community activities. This explanation seemed reasonable on the surface, as caring for sextuplets would indeed represent an overwhelming challenge for any mother. Yet several experienced women in Springfield noted inconsistencies in Samuel's descriptions that suggested his wife's situation might be far different from what he portrayed. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, who had successfully raised 8 children of her own and served as an informal advisor to new mothers throughout the region, became particularly suspicious. When Samuel described Rebecca's daily routine in terms that revealed his fundamental ignorance about infant care, his claims that all 6 babies slept through the night simultaneously, ate on perfectly synchronized schedules, and never cried or fussed contradicted everything that experienced mothers knew about newborn behavior, especially premature infants, who would require even more frequent attention and specialized care. The supplies that Samuel purchased during his weekly trips to town raised additional questions. Among merchants who had developed expertise in predicting their customers' needs based on family size and circumstances, rather than buying the enormous quantities of cloth diapers, infant clothing, and feeding supplies that would be necessary for 6 growing babies. Samuel's purchases included unusual combinations of items that seemed unrelated to childcare. His orders included large amounts of lamp oil for reasons that made no sense during the longer daylight hours of approaching spring. Quantities of vinegar and salt that far exceeded what any household could use for food preservation and medical supplies that seemed more appropriate for treating injuries than caring for healthy infants. Most puzzling were Samuel's requests for specific books and documents that had to be special ordered from suppliers in larger cities, materials that arrived in carefully wrapped packages bearing no identifying marks or return addresses. The local postmaster, Henry Kellner, noted that these shipments came from different cities across the country, including Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and even New Orleans, suggesting that Samuel maintained correspondence with a network of contacts spanning the entire nation. The timing of these deliveries seemed to follow a precise schedule, with new packages arriving exactly 2 weeks apart, regardless of weather conditions or transportation delays that affected normal mail service. Dr. Hayes continued his attempts to gain access to the Whitmore property, motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of Rebecca and the infants, as well as growing suspicion that something far more sinister than difficult childbirth was occurring at the isolated farmstead. His medical training and years of experience treating frontier families had taught him to recognize signs of distress, neglect, or abuse that less experienced observers might miss. And every interaction with Samuel revealed new indicators that the situation required immediate investigation by qualified authorities. The doctor's concerns intensified when he learned that Samuel had been quietly seeking information about legal procedures for transferring property ownership, changing family names, and obtaining new identity documents for reasons that he claimed related to protecting his family from Confederate raiders who might target Union sympathizers. While such precautions were not uncommon during the chaotic war years, Samuel's inquiries focused on procedures that would enable a complete transformation of identity rather than simple protective measures, suggesting plans for permanent relocation under assumed names. Local attorney James Morrison, who handled most property transactions and legal matters for Springfield residents, reported that Samuel had asked detailed questions about dissolving all connections to his current identity, including methods for transferring assets to new names, obtaining fresh documentation that would support different background stories, and ensuring that no legal records could be used to trace his family's movements or activities. These inquiries went far beyond what would be necessary for legitimate security concerns, indicating preparation for flight from serious legal consequences rather than routine wartime precautions. The situation took an alarming turn in early March, when Springfield residents began noticing an increase in the number of strangers visiting the area. Individuals who claimed various business purposes, but displayed suspicious interest in the Whitmore family and their property. These visitors included men who identified themselves as traveling merchants, land speculators, livestock buyers, and other commercial agents, yet their questions consistently focused on the Whitmore farmstead rather than the business opportunities. They supposedly came to investigate. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, who operated Springfield's only boarding house and consequently met most visitors to the area, became increasingly concerned about the nature of these strangers and their true intentions. Unlike typical traveling businessmen who discussed market conditions, transportation routes, and commercial opportunities, these men asked detailed questions about the Whitmore family's daily routines, the layout of their property, the accessibility of their farmhouse, and whether local residents had observed any unusual activities at the isolated homestead. Several of these mysterious visitors possessed knowledge about the Sextuplets that they could not have obtained through casual conversation or local gossip, including details about the timing of the birth, the specific number of children, and even speculation about their unusual characteristics that Samuel had never publicly discussed. This inside information suggested that the strangers were part of an organized effort to gather intelligence about the Whitmore family, possibly in preparation for some kind of coordinated action that would require detailed knowledge of the property and its inhabitants. The most disturbing visitor was a man who identified himself as Professor Nathaniel Cross, claiming to represent a scientific society based in Washington that studied unusual medical phenomena for the benefit of advancing human knowledge. Cross presented credentials that appeared legitimate and spoke with the authority of someone who possessed extensive education and professional experience. Yet his intense interest in the Whitmore sextuplets seemed to extend beyond academic curiosity into something approaching obsession. Professor Cross spent 3 days in Springfield during mid-March, using his time to interview residents about their observations of the Whitmore family and offering substantial payments for any information that might help him locate and examine the children. His willingness to pay far more than such information could possibly be worth suggested that he represented interests with virtually unlimited financial resources and urgent motivation to gain access to the sextuplets regardless of the cost or legal complications that might result from his efforts. Dr. Hayes agreed to meet with Professor Cross, hoping to learn more about the scientific interest in the Whitmore children while also assessing whether this mysterious researcher might pose a threat to the family's safety. The conversation revealed that Cross possessed detailed knowledge about multiple births, genetic inheritance patterns, and developmental abnormalities that seemed far advanced beyond current medical understanding, suggesting access to research and information that was not available through normal academic channels. More unsettling was Cross's apparent familiarity with the specific circumstances of the Whitmore sextuplets, including details about their birth timing, Rebecca's medical background, and even speculation about unusual physical characteristics that no one in Springfield had observed firsthand. When Dr. Hayes asked how Cross had obtained such detailed information about children that no outside observer had been permitted to examine, the professor became evasive and claimed that his sources were confidential contacts within the medical research community who monitored unusual cases throughout the country. Professor Cross also revealed that the Whitmore sextuplets were not the first case of unusual multiple births that had attracted scientific attention during recent years, mentioning similar situations in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia where families had produced children with characteristics that warranted specialized study. His casual references to these other cases suggested a systematic effort to locate and investigate families whose children displayed specific traits or abilities that were of particular interest to his mysterious organization. The professor's visit concluded with an ominous warning that other researchers would soon arrive in Springfield with legal authority to examine the Whitmore children regardless of the family's cooperation or consent. He claimed that wartime emergency powers granted federal authorities broad discretion to investigate matters of potential national security, including medical phenomena that might affect military capabilities or civilian population health. His suggestion that the sextuplets represented a potential threat that required immediate government intervention struck Dr. Hayes as both legally dubious and personally threatening. Within days of Professor Cross's departure, Springfield residents began observing increased activity around the Whitmore property that suggested the family was preparing for immediate departure despite the challenging traveling conditions that persisted through late winter. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimneys at all hours, indicating intensive activity that required continuous heating and lighting, while the sounds of packing, moving, and construction work could be heard by anyone who approached close enough to the buildings. Samuel's trips to town became more frequent and urgent, with purchases that included traveling supplies, preserved foods, and equipment suitable for long-distance transportation rather than routine farming materials. His behavior grew increasingly nervous and distracted, with conversations that revealed his awareness of the mounting pressure from outside forces and his determination to protect his family from whatever consequences might result from continued scrutiny of their situation. The most telling evidence of the family's desperate circumstances came when Samuel attempted to sell his property to multiple potential buyers simultaneously. offering the farmstead at prices far below its actual value in exchange for immediate cash payments and agreements to complete the transaction without normal legal documentation or government recording. His willingness to abandon valuable property for a fraction of its worth suggested preparation for flight from consequences that he considered far more serious than financial loss. Local residents who had initially celebrated the remarkable birth of the sextuplets now found themselves caught between curiosity about the children's welfare and growing fear that their community had become involved in something far more dangerous and mysterious than anyone had imagined. The transformation of a simple farming family into the focus of organized scientific investigation and potential government intervention created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that affected everyone in Springfield. The final incident that convinced Dr. Hayes that immediate action was necessary occurred on March 28th, when he encountered Samuel attempting to purchase chloroform, laudanum, and other powerful sedatives in quantities that far exceeded any legitimate medical need. When questioned about his requirements for such dangerous substances, Samuel claimed that Rebecca needed pain relief for complications from childbirth. Yet his nervous behavior and obvious deception suggested preparations for something far more sinister than routine medical treatment. The truth about the Whitmore sextuplets began to emerge through a series of horrifying discoveries that transformed what appeared to be an extraordinary medical phenomenon into something far more sinister and disturbing than anyone in Springfield could have imagined. The first breakthrough came when Jacob Miller, Samuel's former hired hand, decided to conduct his own investigation after growing increasingly concerned about the welfare of Rebecca and the children, who had remained invisible to the outside world for more than 3 months. Jacob's opportunity arose during a severe thunderstorm in early April, when Samuel made one of his urgent trips to Springfield, leaving the farmstead apparently unguarded for the first time since the children's birth. Taking advantage of the storm's cover and his familiarity with the property's layout, Jacob approached the farmhouse through the surrounding woods, using deer paths and natural concealment to avoid detection by anyone who might be watching for intruders. What Jacob discovered through the farmhouse windows shattered every assumption that Springfield residents had made about the Whitmore family and their remarkable children. The main floor rooms that should have contained evidence of infant care, including cribs, feeding supplies, clothing, and the countless items necessary for raising 6 babies, stood completely empty except for scientific equipment that belonged in a laboratory rather than a family home. Glass containers filled with unknown liquids lined the walls. Metal instruments that resembled surgical tools covered every available surface, and detailed anatomical charts and diagrams decorated the spaces where family photographs and domestic comforts should have been displayed. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any signs that children had ever lived in the house, despite Samuel's claims that Rebecca spent every waking moment caring for the sextuplets. No toys, no infant clothing, no feeding bottles, no cradles or rocking chairs, no evidence whatsoever that the farmhouse served as home to 6 growing babies, who should have required constant attention and specialized equipment for their survival and development. Jacob's exploration of the basement revealed an even more shocking transformation of what had once been simple root storage into something resembling a combination laboratory, operating theater, and prison. The excavated chambers that Samuel had claimed were necessary for storing farm supplies contained equipment that clearly served scientific and medical purposes, including examination tables, restraining devices, preservation tanks filled with chemical solutions, and documentation. Systems that recorded detailed observations in technical language that Jacob could not understand. The walls of these underground chambers were covered with charts and diagrams that depicted human anatomy in ways that suggested research into developmental abnormalities, genetic variations, and physical characteristics that extended far beyond normal medical knowledge. Some of these materials appeared to focus specifically on multiple births, showing detailed studies of twins, triplets, and higher-order births that had been documented with scientific precision that seemed impossible to achieve without access to subjects who could be observed over extended periods. Most horrifying were the preservation tanks that contained what appeared to be human specimens suspended in chemical solutions, though the lighting conditions and Jacob's own terror made it impossible to determine the exact nature of these materials or their relationship to the Whitmore family situation. The sizes and shapes of these specimens suggested that they might be related to infant development, though Jacob's limited medical knowledge prevented him from understanding their specific significance or the procedures that had been used to obtain them. The documentation that Jacob discovered in the basement included detailed records written in multiple languages, suggesting international collaboration on research projects that extended far beyond what any individual family or local organization could have developed independently. These records contain technical terminology, scientific measurements, and observational data that indicated systematic study of human subjects over extended periods, with particular attention to characteristics that seemed to focus on physical and mental abilities that exceeded normal human ranges. Jacob also found correspondence that revealed the true scope of the network that had been monitoring the Whitmore family and their children. Letters from individuals in major cities throughout the United States and Europe indicated that the Sextuplets were part of a much larger project involving similar families in multiple locations, all apparently selected for specific genetic traits that made their children valuable for scientific research that required absolute secrecy and immunity from legal oversight. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed schedule that outlined plans for transferring the Whitmore children to a permanent research facility located somewhere in the northeastern United States, where they would be studied continuously throughout their development without any contact with normal society or conventional education. This schedule indicated that the children's current isolation was merely a temporary arrangement while preparations were completed for their permanent removal from Missouri and their integration into a scientific program that would treat them as experimental subjects rather than human beings. Rebecca's role in this conspiracy became clear through medical journals that documented her participation in procedures that had nothing to do with routine childcare and everything to do with scientific experimentation on the infants she was supposed to be protecting as their mother. Her background as a trained midwife had apparently been fabricated to provide cover for her true expertise in procedures that enabled researchers to study human development in ways that would be impossible through normal medical observation. The journals revealed that Rebecca had been administering experimental substances to the children, conducting physical examinations that involved invasive procedures, and documenting their responses to various stimuli in ways that treated them as laboratory animals rather than her own offspring. Her detailed observations included measurements, behavioral assessments, and physiological data that were being transmitted to outside researchers who used this information to refine their understanding of human development and genetic expression. Samuel's true role extended far beyond that of a simple farmer protecting his family from outside interference. The evidence suggested that he served as a coordinator for a network of researchers who required isolated locations where their experiments could be conducted without government oversight or public awareness. His modifications to the farmhouse and surrounding buildings had created a sophisticated research facility disguised as a typical frontier homestead, complete with communication systems that enabled regular contact with collaborators in distant cities. The financial resources that had enabled Samuel to purchase the property, construct the underground laboratories, and obtain advanced scientific equipment came from sources that extended far beyond what any legitimate farmer could have access through normal economic channels. Banking records that Jacob discovered hidden in the basement indicated regular payments from multiple accounts in different cities, suggesting funding from an organized network with substantial financial backing and the ability to operate across state and territorial boundaries without legal complications. Most shocking was the revelation that the Whitmore sextuplets were not unique, but rather represented one example of a systematic effort to identify, obtain, and study children with specific genetic characteristics that made them valuable for research into human development, hereditary traits, and abilities that exceeded normal ranges. Similar families had been established in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, Ohio, and other states where isolated properties provided cover for scientific activities that required absolute secrecy and freedom from legal interference. The network's methods for identifying suitable families involved monitoring birth records, medical reports, and community observations to locate children who displayed unusual characteristics or came from bloodlines that suggested genetic traits of particular scientific interest. Once identified, these families were approached through elaborate deceptions that provided cover stories for relocating them to isolated properties, where their children could be studied without outside interference or awareness of their true circumstances. The scientific objectives of this research remained unclear from the documents that Jacob was able to examine during his brief exploration, though the technical terminology and detailed procedures suggested investigation into human capabilities that extended far beyond conventional medical knowledge. References to enhanced physical abilities, unusual mental development, and genetic expressions that appeared only under specific conditions indicated research into aspects of human potential that conventional science had not yet discovered or acknowledged. The timeline for the research suggested that the children would be studied throughout their entire development from infancy through adulthood, with particular attention to critical periods when genetic traits might manifest in ways that could be documented and analyzed for scientific advancement. This long-term commitment required facilities and resources that could operate independently of normal social institutions while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent government interference or public awareness of their activities. Jacob's discovery also revealed that the network had developed procedures for eliminating threats to their research, including methods for discrediting or removing individuals who became too curious about their activities. Several references in the correspondence mentioned previous cases where outside interference had been neutralized through techniques that ensured both the continuation of their research and the protection of their overall operations from legal consequences. The realization that Springfield's celebration of the remarkable sextuplet birth had actually marked the beginning of their community's involvement in a scientific conspiracy of unprecedented scope and danger created an atmosphere of terror that motivated Jacob to seek immediate help from authorities who possessed the power and resources necessary to confront such a sophisticated criminal organization. However, Jacob's attempts to alert local law enforcement revealed that the network's influence extended into official channels that should have provided protection for the children and their community. Sheriff Martin Cole's response to Jacob's report demonstrated either corruption or intimidation that prevented him from taking appropriate action against the Whitmore operation, suggesting that the conspiracy included provisions for neutralizing legal challenges before they could threaten their scientific objectives. The depth of the network's planning and the sophistication of their operations indicated that the Whitmore case represented just one small part of a much larger effort to advance human knowledge through methods that violated every principle of medical ethics, legal protection, and human dignity that civilized society had developed to protect its most vulnerable members from exploitation and abuse. The unraveling of the Whitmore conspiracy began with an unexpected ally whose arrival in Springfield would prove to be the catalyst that finally exposed the full horror of what had been occurring at the isolated farmstead. Captain Jonathan Pierce of the Union Army's Medical Corps had been conducting a routine inspection of military hospitals and civilian medical facilities throughout Missouri when he received disturbing reports about unusual scientific activities that might pose risks to military personnel or civilian populations in the region. Captain Pierce possessed both the authority and expertise necessary to investigate situations that civilian law enforcement might be unable or unwilling to address, particularly cases involving potential medical experiments that could affect public health or military readiness. His background included service as a battlefield surgeon during some of the war's bloodiest campaigns, experience that had taught him to recognize signs of medical misconduct and to distinguish between legitimate research and dangerous experimentation that violated accepted standards of human treatment. The captain's investigation began when he received Jacob Miller's desperate letter describing the discoveries at the Whitmore farmstead and the apparent corruption or intimidation that had prevented local authorities from taking appropriate action. Jacob's detailed account of the underground laboratories, scientific equipment, and evidence of systematic experimentation on infants convinced Pierce that federal intervention was necessary to protect both the children and the broader community from whatever consequences might result from continued exposure to such dangerous activities. Pierce arrived in Springfield on April 20th with a team of military investigators, medical personnel, and legal authorities who possessed the power to conduct thorough examinations of the Whitmore property, regardless of local resistance or attempts at obstruction. His team included Dr. Margaret Foster, one of the few female physicians in military service whose expertise in pediatric medicine made her essential for evaluating the condition of the sextuplets. Sergeant Major William Turner, an experienced investigator who specialized in complex criminal cases involving military or civilian personnel, and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Adams, a legal officer whose authority enabled the team to override local objections and conduct comprehensive searches of private property when national security concerns were involved. The military team's approach to the Whitmore property occurred at dawn on April 21st, using coordinated movements that prevented Samuel or Rebecca from destroying evidence or escaping with the children before their activities could be thoroughly documented. Pierce had learned from previous investigations that sophisticated criminal operations often included contingency plans for eliminating evidence and witnesses when discovery became imminent, making it essential to secure the entire property simultaneously, while preventing any communication with outside accomplices who might assist in covering up or continuing their illegal activities. Samuel's reaction to the military intervention revealed both his awareness of the serious legal consequences he faced and his determination to protect the network's broader operations, even at the cost of his own capture. Rather than attempting to deny the accusations or claim innocence, he immediately demanded to speak with federal authorities who he claimed possessed jurisdiction over his research activities and the authority to prevent military interference with scientific work that served national interests. His insistence that the research conducted at his property was authorized by government agencies created initial confusion among Pierce's team, particularly when Samuel produced documents that appeared to grant him immunity from local prosecution and permission to conduct medical experiments under federal oversight. However, Captain Pierce's experience with military bureaucracy and his contacts within federal medical research programs enabled him to quickly verify that these documents were either forged or had been issued by individuals who lacked the authority to approve such activities. Rebecca's behavior during the initial confrontation proved even more revealing than her husband's attempts at legal misdirection. Her immediate concern focused not on the welfare of the children she claimed to love and protect, but on securing specific research materials that she insisted were essential for the continuation of scientific work that extended far beyond their individual situation. Her detailed knowledge of experimental procedures and her obvious familiarity with technical terminology that exceeded what any frontier midwife should have possessed confirmed that her role in the conspiracy involved far more sophisticated activities than routine childcare. The search of the farmhouse revealed evidence that exceeded even Jacob Miller's horrifying discoveries, exposing the full scope of the scientific apparatus that had been constructed under the cover of simple frontier domesticity. Dr. Foster's examination of the basement. Laboratories uncovered equipment that belonged in the most advanced medical research facilities of major universities, rather than an isolated Missouri farmstead, including microscopes, chemical analysis apparatus, surgical instruments, and preservation systems that represented investments of thousands of dollars and access to scientific suppliers who normally served only institutional customers. Most disturbing was the documentation that revealed the systematic nature of the research being conducted on the Whitmore sextuplets and similar children in other locations throughout the country. Detailed records showed that the children had been subjected to regular medical examinations that involved invasive procedures, experimental medications, and psychological testing designed to evaluate their mental and physical development in ways that treated them as laboratory subjects, rather than human beings deserving protection and normal childhood experiences. The children themselves, when finally located in the deepest basement chambers, presented a sight that would haunt every member of the military team for the rest of their lives, rather than the healthy, normal infants that Samuel had described. In his communications with Springfield residents, the 6 children showed clear evidence of systematic abuse, medical experimentation, and developmental abnormalities that suggested exposure to substances or procedures that had permanently altered their physical and mental characteristics. Dr. Foster's initial examination revealed that all 6 children displayed unusual physical traits that seemed to result from deliberate manipulation rather than natural genetic variation. Their growth patterns indicated exposure to substances that had accelerated certain aspects of their development while retarding others, creating combinations of infant and adult characteristics that suggested experimental attempts to enhance specific abilities while suppressing normal human development processes. The children's behavior patterns provided even more disturbing evidence of the psychological damage inflicted by their treatment as experimental subjects rather than beloved family members. They showed no recognition of normal human interaction, failed to respond to attempts at comfort or play, and displayed reactions to stimuli that suggested conditioning through techniques that treated them as laboratory animals rather than developing human beings who required love, security, and age-appropriate care. Medical examinations revealed evidence of surgical procedures that had been performed for research purposes rather than therapeutic necessity, including cranial modifications that appeared designed to provide access to brain tissue for direct observation or manipulation. These procedures, which would have required sophisticated surgical skills and equipment, demonstrated that the network operating through the Whitmore farmstead possessed resources and expertise that extended far beyond what any individual researcher could have developed independently. The documentation discovered in Samuel's hidden files revealed the true scope of the conspiracy and the identities of key figures in a network that extended throughout the United States and into several European countries. Correspondence with researchers in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, New York, London, Paris, and Berlin indicated international collaboration on projects that involved systematic study of human development through methods that violated every principle of medical ethics and legal protection that civilized societies had established to prevent such exploitation. The network's organizational structure included universities, government agencies, private research foundations, and wealthy individuals who provided funding and resources for activities that could not be conducted through normal institutional channels due to legal restrictions and ethical oversight. This sophisticated support system enabled researchers to operate with virtual immunity from legal consequences while pursuing scientific objectives that required absolute secrecy and freedom from public scrutiny or professional accountability. Captain Pierce's investigation revealed that the network had been actively recruiting families with specific genetic characteristics for more than a decade, using elaborate deceptions to relocate them to isolated properties where their children could be studied throughout their entire development without interference from normal social institutions or legal protections. The Whitmore case represented just one example of dozens of similar operations that had been established in remote locations throughout the American West, where frontier conditions provided cover for activities that would have been impossible in more settled regions with stronger law enforcement and greater public oversight. The methods used to identify suitable families involved monitoring birth records, medical reports, and community observations to locate children whose characteristics suggested genetic traits that were of particular scientific interest. Once identified, these families were approached through carefully constructed deceptions that provided convincing explanations for relocating to properties where their children could be studied without outside awareness or interference. The selection criteria used by the network focused on families whose circumstances made them unlikely to resist relocation or question the conditions they encountered at their new homes. Refugees from war zones, immigrants seeking new opportunities, and individuals fleeing legal or financial difficulties proved particularly vulnerable to recruitment because their desperate situations made them willing to accept arrangements that more secure families would have rejected or investigated more thoroughly. The network's long-term objectives, as revealed through captured correspondence and research documents, extended far beyond simple scientific curiosity about human development and genetic variation. The detailed procedures and systematic approaches to experimentation suggested attempts to identify and enhance human capabilities that could provide military advantages, economic benefits, or social control mechanisms that would serve the interests of those who funded and directed the research. Activities. References to enhanced physical strength, accelerated intellectual development, and resistance to diseases or environmental hazards indicated research into creating human beings with capabilities that exceeded normal ranges, possibly for use in military operations, dangerous industrial activities, or other applications that required superhuman endurance or abilities. The systematic approach to these experiments suggested confidence that such enhancements were possible through techniques that the network had developed through years of research on unwilling subjects. The timeline for the research indicated that the network expected to continue their activities for decades, with provisions for studying their subjects throughout their entire lifespans to document the long-term effects of their experimental procedures. This commitment required facilities, resources, and organizational structures that could operate independently of normal social institutions, while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent government interference or public awareness of their true activities. The network's procedures for eliminating threats to their research included detailed contingency plans for dealing with discovery, investigation, or legal challenges that might compromise their operations. These plans involved techniques for discrediting witnesses, corrupting official investigations, and removing individuals who posed serious risks to their continued activities, through methods that ensured both the protection of their research and the elimination of evidence that could lead to broader exposure of their network. Dr. Foster's continued examination of the Whitmore children revealed that their condition was far worse than initial observations had suggested, with evidence of systematic damage that would require years of specialized medical treatment to address and might never be completely reversible. The combination of physical alterations, psychological conditioning, and developmental abnormalities created by their experimental treatment had transformed them into tragic examples of human beings whose potential had been sacrificed for scientific objectives that served no legitimate purpose. The children's inability to respond to normal human interaction, their lack of basic social and emotional development, and their obvious fear of adults indicated that their treatment had included psychological manipulation designed to make them compliant subjects for continued experimentation, rather than helping them develop into healthy, independent individuals capable of normal human relationships and social integration. Captain Pierce's investigation also revealed that the network maintained detailed records of their experimental results and had been sharing this information with collaborators throughout the United States and Europe who were conducting similar research on other subjects. The systematic nature of this data collection and distribution indicated that the Whitmore children were part of a much larger scientific project that involved hundreds or possibly thousands of subjects who had been obtained through similar deceptions and were being studied under comparable conditions. The evidence collected during the investigation included thousands of pages of research documents, correspondence with network members, financial records showing the sources of funding for their activities, and physical proof of the experimental procedures that had been conducted on the children. This comprehensive documentation provided irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy's scope and the systematic violation of human rights that had been occurring under the cover of legitimate scientific research. The military team's discovery of additional network facilities in other states confirmed that the Whitmore operation was indeed part of a much larger conspiracy that required coordinated federal action to prevent continued exploitation of vulnerable families and their children. The sophistication of the network's organization and the sophistication of the network's organization and the sophistication extent of their resources indicated that exposing and dismantling their operations would require sustained effort by multiple agencies with the authority and expertise necessary to confront such a complex criminal enterprise. The military tribunal that convened in St. Louis during summer 1864 delivered swift justice to Samuel and Rebecca Whitmore, sentencing both to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity and conspiracy to conduct illegal medical experiments on children. However, the broader network that had enabled their operation proved far more resilient than anyone anticipated, with key figures disappearing before arrests could be made and critical evidence mysteriously vanishing from supposedly secure government facilities. The 6 Whitmore children were transferred to a specialized military hospital where Dr. Foster and her team attempted to reverse the damage caused by years of systematic experimentation. While some physical improvements were achieved through careful treatment, the psychological trauma and developmental abnormalities proved largely irreversible, leaving the children permanently disabled and incapable of normal social integration or independent living. Captain Pierce's investigation ultimately identified 17 similar facilities operating across 8 states, though only 6 were successfully raided before the network activated contingency plans that enabled most conspirators to escape. Prosecution. The seized documents revealed that over 300 children had been subjected to experimental procedures, with many others disappearing entirely when their usefulness to the research program ended. The government's response included new federal regulations governing medical research and stronger oversight of scientific activities involving human subjects. Yet these measures came too late to prevent the permanent damage inflicted on countless families whose children had been sacrificed for scientific objectives that served no legitimate purpose. The network's international connections ensured that similar research continued in other countries where legal protections remained inadequate. The Whitmore farmstead was burned to the ground by order of the military authorities, though local residents reported that strange lights and unexplained phenomena continued to manifest at the site for decades afterward. The property remained abandoned, with several attempts at development failing due to accidents, equipment malfunctions, and worker reports of disturbing sounds emanating from the areas where the underground laboratories had been constructed. Modern historians studying Civil War-era medical practices have found references to the Whitmore case in classified government archives, though most documents remain sealed under national security provisions that prevent full disclosure of the networks activities, and the extent of government knowledge about their operations. Recent Freedom of Information Act requests have yielded only heavily redacted reports that raise more questions than they answer about official involvement in or awareness of the conspiracy. The fate of the surviving children remained classified for over a century, with government records indicating only that they received specialized care until their deaths in the early 20th century. None ever developed sufficient cognitive abilities to provide testimony about their experiences, taking the full truth about their treatment to their graves and ensuring that many aspects of the conspiracy would never be fully understood or documented. The scientific knowledge gained through these horrific experiments was allegedly destroyed to prevent its misuse, though persistent rumors suggest that some research data was preserved and incorporated into later government programs involving human enhancement and genetic manipulation. The true extent of what was learned through the systematic abuse of these children may never be known, as the ethical violations involved make any potential benefits morally indefensible. Today, the Whitmore case serves as a chilling reminder of how scientific curiosity without ethical constraints can transform ordinary people into monsters capable of unspeakable cruelty. The systematic nature of their crimes and the sophisticated organization that enabled their activities demonstrate that the greatest threats to human dignity often come not from individual madness, but from institutional failures that allow evil to flourish under the protection of authority and respectability. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.